good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining this talk. And I'm going to tell you about how Mrs. Eleanor Coade, Georgian businesswoman extraordinaire, stood up to two of the most influential men in the architecture of her day. As Kasia has said, in 2015, Landmark completed the restoration of this 18th century seaside villa in Lyme Regis, owned by the remarkable Mrs. Eleanor Coade for more than 40 years. And as the Trust's historian, by 2015, I'd already spent several years researching Mrs. Coade. But this little case study is more recent work and considers how Mrs. Coade held her own against two of the most powerful influences of late Georgian architecture, architect Sir William Chambers and patron Horace Walpole. And it also stands as an example of how work was commissioned from the Coade firm. Eleanor Coade lived from 1733 to 1821, and she left no known portrait and never married, so mistress or Mrs. was an honorary form of respectful address. From 1769, when she was in her mid-30s, she ran an artificial stone manufactory in Lambeth, seen here. Today, the site is swallowed beneath the Hayward Gallery as part of the South Bank complex, but in the late 18th century, it occupied a prime riverside site just east of the recently built Westminster Bridge. The firm created high-quality statuary and architectural embellishment from a kind of stoneware which was fired in a kiln. And this kiln firing made it highly frost and weather resistant and allowed Coade to claim justifiably that it was superior to natural stone. She soon branded it Coade Stone, and the manufactory was so successful that within a decade, her name became synonymous with the artificial stone sector, transforming late Georgian architecture and seeing off all her competitors. To achieve such preeminence, Coade had to interact effectively with the very male world of architecture and the building trades. So this talk examines an example of how she achieved such success in the increasingly savvy consumer world of the late 18th century. Coade's documentary record has all but vanished beyond scattered receipts and invoices, so her wares are her main legacy in the historical record. But we're going to look at a rare surviving documentary source of a meeting that occurred in the spring of 1772 after Horace Walpole had commissioned a pair of Gothic gateposts for his house at Strawberry Hill in Twickenham. Sadly, these gateposts survive today only as a few fragments in a Twickenham front garden. By 1772, Walpole had been creating this fairy tale confection for more than 20 years already and had turned his attention to beautifying its grounds. But his Coade commission turned sour. Walpole felt he'd been overcharged for the gateposts and sent in the well-established Sir William Chambers to investigate. As we will see, Chambers reported back to Walpole in a letter, a letter long on the record, but whose wider personalities and context have not previously been examined. So the result is a revealing case study of how a client like Walpole commissioned Coade pieces, of the Coade firm's flexibility in the production of very intricate reproductions, of Eleanor Coade's own ability to keep and produce detailed and convincing financial records, and of her professionalism in countering a claim against her fledgling enterprise, even when it originated from a figure as famous and potentially daunting as Horace Walpole. Our story begins with a visit by Walpole in July 1769 to Cambridge to see his old friend from Eton days, William Cole. Walpole and Cole shared a passion for the Gothic, and Walpole knew he could rely on Cole for accuracy of detail as he developed Strawberry Hill. He had already found a fine pair of iron gates. Now he needed inspiration for appropriate gateposts to mount them. The pair went from Cambridge to Ely Cathedral, where Walpole saw and admired the tomb of Bishop William de Luder, created in 1298. Its corner towers were just the thing to act as piers to set off his new gates. And Walpole had form in plagiarizing episcopal tombs at Strawberry Hill. As we see here, he twice used such tombs as sources for his chimney pieces, Bishop's Warehams in his Holbein chamber, and Bishop Dudley in the great north bedchamber. These chimney pieces, however, were made of Portland stone rather than artificial stone. In Ely, Walpole and Cole were entertained by Joseph Bentham, who was mayor of Cambridge and printer to the university, and whose brother James was writing a history of Ely Cathedral. The 1771 edition of James Bentham's book includes this engraving of the Luder tomb, paid for by William Cole, and perhaps commissioned in part as a souvenir of the day's visit. A month after the visit, in July 1769, Walpole wrote to Cole about his plans for the gateway, including a couple of ill-formed thumbnail sketches in the margins of the letter. "Here are the directions for Mr. Essex for the piers of my gates," he wrote. "Bishop Luder must not be offended at my converting his tomb into a gateway." He then gives detailed dimensions of the gates and his desired dimensions for the gateposts. The end result was a large gateway. The iron gates alone were 6 feet wide and almost 8 feet high. And Mr. Essex in Walpole's letter is James Essex, one of the most prolific architects of 18th century Cambridgeshire. Essex had been appointed to oversee the repair and restoration of Ely Cathedral, and it was he who produced the drawing of the tomb and then presumably sized the commission for the gateposts from the Lambeth manufactory. Horace Walpole was famously as cavalier in his use of materials at Strawberry Hill as he was loose in his adaptation of architectural sources, but it is nevertheless interesting that he selected fired artificial stone to make his new Gothic gateway, rather than Portland stone as for his chimney pieces. It was an astonishingly large and ambitious design for the Lambeth craftsman to execute. 1769, as we've heard, was not only the year of the Ely Cathedral visit, but also the year Mrs. Coade took on what she later described as the failing Lambeth manufactory with her mother. This pre-existing manufactory was run by a man called Daniel Pincott, established as a maker of fired artificial stone goods since the early 1760s. And initially, the Coades, Eleanor and her mother, and Daniel Pincott were in partnership. The following spring, in March 1770, Daniel Pincott published a treatise, an essay on the origins, nature, use and properties of artificial stone. And Horace Walpole had a copy of this in his library. So when on the 8th of June 1771, Walpole wrote to his friend Horace Mann that "I have made a Gothic gateway to the garden, the piers of which are artificial stone and very respectable," he was almost certainly referring to a work initially commissioned from Daniel Pincott rather than Coade. The gateposts had taken almost 2 years from conception to installation. The finished pieces appear in various contemporary illustrations and seen here on the left, and they do seem to have been a triumph of the artificial stone process. Each pinnacle was surrounded by 4 needles, and their surfaces are covered in Gothic tracery and tiny crockets. However, Walpole was not content. The question was one of cost rather than quality, and here we see Walpole in Rowlandson's illustration reading in front of his Gothic gateway. Coade had charged Walpole £175, 12 shillings and 10 pence for the gate piers, and Walpole considered this too much. By May 1772, they were in dispute, leading Walpole to put William Chambers in to bat. On the 26th of May 1772, Chambers wrote brusquely to Coade, "Mr. Walpole insists upon your choosing a person to meet me in order to settle the dispute between you. Appoint, therefore, whoever you think proper, and I will meet them at your house any evening about 5, the beginning of next week." So far, this tale appears to bear little relationship to Coade's practice as a businesswoman. However, 8 months earlier, in September 1771, Mrs. Coade had placed terse adverts in the Daily Advertiser newspaper, announcing that Pincott had been dismissed and had no further involvement with the manufactory. There is no evidence that either Coade or her mother had any experience in artificial stone, or indeed any ceramics, when they emerged as business angels for Pincott's manufactory 2 years earlier. His very public dismissal now meant Coade was potentially on her own in dealing with Walpole's objection about an order almost certainly placed with Pincott rather than herself. And in appointing Chambers as his go-between, Walpole had chosen one of the best regarded architects of the day. In 1759, Chambers had published his Treatise on Civil Architecture, and since 1766, he'd held the unofficial title of King Architect to the King, jointly with Robert Adam. This was a serious challenge to the new Coade firm. And Chambers' report on his visit to the Coade manufactory on Monday, the 18th of June, 1772, along with Coade's chosen representative, Mr. Whately, her friend, provides another professional's detailed commentary on Coade's business practice. It is a rare and possibly the only eyewitness account of the manufactory's working practice. And the letter is worth quoting at length, so here are some extracts as we look at an illustration of the workyard at the Coade manufactory. Chambers writes, "Sir, I spent a good part of the afternoon last Friday at the stone manufactory in examining Mrs. Coade's claim upon you for the piers at Strawberry Hill. I saw the model, and she produced a letter from the maker. We then saw the moulds, which are very formidable things, and we believed not overcharged in the account any more than the quantity of the composition used. Of the price, we are no judges, but suppose from the nature of the materials of which it is composed and the method of preparing it, that it must be worth as much as plaster. She has charged something less for it. We then saw an account of the expenses of burning a kiln of goods, as they call it, and it amounted to 5 guineas according to her book, but as there were some items there we thought overrated, we reduced it to 4 guineas. Upon inspection of the kiln, or rather oven, we believed that the piers could not be burnt in less than 4 times firing. The wages for modelling ornaments, moulding and repairing seemed to us incredible, but she produced a book wherein a regular account of time was kept, which had all the marks of authenticity. We then examined some of the manufacture just taken out of the moulds and compared it with what was finished, and saw the method and difficulty of repairing it, which convinced us that the reparation was a very tedious and expensive work. To conclude, we were mutually of the opinion that it had cost Mrs. Coade upwards of £150, exclusive of profit, etc. As she has offered to accept £100 rather than incur your displeasure, we advised her to leave it entirely to your goodness to settle it as you should judge reasonable. With regard to the repair, she is willing to put up the 1 pinnacle that is wanting and the 8 flowers without any expense to you, but if more should be wanting, she hopes you will consider it." So various observations can be made about Coade's business practice as revealed in this letter. First, For all Walpole's insistence via Chambers upon your choosing a person to meet me in order to settle the dispute, Coade herself was present at the meeting and was both engaging as an equal and treated as one. Chambers' letter expresses no hint of patronising Coade as a member of the frailer sex, a trait so often apparent in 18th century male discourse. She is presented entirely neutrally and respectfully in the interaction, and equal in the business in hand. This may be a reflection of Chambers' own character, but the respect has also been earned by Coade herself. As for the Mr. Whatley that Coade engaged as her friend in the dispute, Kemble Whatley was a Lambeth neighbour and a well-established carpenter and timber merchant. He had a record of government employment stretching back decades and would soon become High Sheriff of Surrey. As someone au fait with architectural contracts and practice, he was an ideal mediator for Coade, and the fact that she was able to introduce an ally at such short notice is an interesting illustration of her network of contacts. As a timber merchant, Whatley was also a reliable witness in assessing the firing cost of the wood-fired kiln. Coade was able to open up fully not just the manufactory itself, but also its detailed financial records. Good record keeping is essential in keeping track of a business. Then as now, businesses often failed due to poor bookkeeping, leading to a failure to call in debt and crises of credit. It is not possible to say how or when Coade had learnt to keep accounts, perhaps in her father's counting house in Exeter for his fuller's business in her younger days, or perhaps from one of the various bookkeeping manuals of the day. Either way, it is evident that she did keep accounts and that she did so well. The accounts also reveal the many stages of production and the meticulous craft process involved, beyond even what Chambers expected as a cosmopolitan man with a good eye for art. The wages for modelling, ornaments, moulding and repairing seemed to us incredible, but she produced a book wherein a regular account of time was kept, which had all the marks of authenticity. And there's also a degree of negotiation in the encounter. Coade was beaten down on her subcontractor, the modeller's costs, in the first line here, but was judged to have charged fairly for the mould. Chambers and Whatley deferred to her judgment on the cost of raw materials, moulds, cases, oil and lard, and also with implied surprise that she charged less than plaster of Paris for her proprietary raw material. They were also impressed with the degree of finishing needed after the firing, very tedious and expensive work, much more so than could be imagined by any who had not seen it done. And on this basis, they did not dispute the wage bill, which accounted for over a third of the total costs. And there's one more fascinating, if cryptic, element in their value assessment for Walpole. It includes Pincot's attendance. At some £23, this is a relatively large item and suggests that Daniel Pincott had indeed overseen the production and was perhaps also called in to attend the site meeting. Pincott's fee was slashed in half by Chambers, no doubt rubbing further salt into the wound of his dismissal from the manufactory. Either Coade was using Pincott as a scapegoat, or, more likely, she had not so completely burnt bridges to prevent his continued involvement as a consultant. Earlier Coade scholarship has so far assumed that there was no further contact between them. Either way, Eleanor Coade was demonstrating an astute ability to juggle and use working relationships just 2 years into her new enterprise. Overall, Chambers and Whatley judged that the Gate Piers had cost Coade a little over £151 to make, rather than the 175 or so she'd charged Walpole. The difference implies a declared and not unreasonable profit margin of around 14%. And we can sense Coade taking Chambers aback by her offer to accept just £100 for the gateposts rather than incur Walpole's displeasure. Faced with this, even the experienced Chambers preferred to leave the final judgment on worth to Walpole's own conscience. And the following year, Walpole paid Coade £151, 14 shillings and 10pence, exactly the sum recommended by Chambers and Whately. And Coade had one last flourish up her sleeve. It seems that there were some defects in the gate piers, whether caused by manufacture or installation. With keen understanding of the importance of style influencers like Walpole to a brand's success, Coade offered to put up the one pinnacle that is wanted and the 8 flowers at her own expense, while making the point that if more should be wanting, she hopes you will consider it. It's finely judged psychologically, walking the line between the due obsequiousness of a supplier and the credibility of a self-respecting manufacturer. It was a remarkably self-assured performance in ensuring quality control of her end product. So too was her complete transparency in opening up all aspects of the manufacturing process. Coade correctly judges that such transparency will leave her interlocutors impressed by the skill in the process and in her honesty, and reinforce her reputation. Chambers' letter is the richest source I've so far discovered for Coade as a businesswoman. This tale of Walpole's gateposts reveals Coade engaging from the moment of her arrival in Lambeth in effective business and financial practices in exactly the same way as her male peers and superiors, meeting them on equal terms when contention arose and making no concession or reference to her gender. Earlier scholarship marked Eleanor Coade out as an exceptional example of a never married woman running her own successful business. The Married Women's Property Act was seen as seriously inhibiting female entrepreneurship. However, more recent research has shown significant numbers of women operating successful businesses throughout the 18th century. For all Coade's uniqueness in the architectural sphere, we should not therefore necessarily find her business competence surprising. What remains exceptional is her skill in marketing her product and in making it synonymous with her own name in a way few others of either gender succeeded in doing, especially in the field of architecture, and uniquely for this in architecture. Eleanor Coade sailed on untroubled by her encounter with Walpole and Chambers, and ran her successful business for another 40 years, involved right up until her death in 1821 at the age of 89 years old. Thank you.